Egypt has always traditionally been given prominence as the height of ancient culture. Nubia is now coming into its own and is being understood to be of equal importance. It is different from ancient Egypt, but it is equally important and not just an adjunct to this Egyptian culture.
Ancient Egypt is oftentimes regarded as Africa's oldest great civilization. But what if I was to tell you that that isn't actually the case? What if I told you that an even older ancient African civilization, just as great as Kemet, existed? Yeah, really. Although just as great and ancient as Kemet, this civilization is often overlooked by mainstream scholars and the general media. And if this civilization is mentioned at all, it doesn't often get the respect it deserves. Why is that, you may ask? Well, that's because unlike its sister civilization to the north of the Nile Valley, this civilization does not have a race controversy. All the scholars agree they were Black Africans. And as we should know too well by now is that great Black African achievements tend to get overlooked or swept under the rug by you-know-who. I won't say any names here. And that's why we're here, to rectify that. So without further ado, let me introduce you to ancient Egypt's older sister, Nubia, also known as Ta-Seti, the land of the bow. In this video, we're going to briefly talk about the history, the peopling, and some of the great achievements of ancient Nubia. So Ta-Seti, what's the history? What do the scholars know about it? Is it really older than Kemet? Well, these are the questions that will be answered in the first part of our video, a brief history. What does Nubia or Ta-Seti refer to? Ta-Seti refers to a group of ancient African civilizations that emerged and flourished in the southern part of the Nile Valley some very long time ago. This civilization is also known as Nubia, Kerma, Meroe, or Kush, depending on the period we are talking about. But one thing worth noting is that Nubia usually refers to the area located in northern Sudan, whereas Kerma, Kush, or Meroe would be referring to a specific period in the history of the civilization of the area known as Nubia. Nubia is also the civilization from which came the originators of dynastic Kemet. These originators would be the Nakta people I talked about at length in my previous video that you might want to check out on my channel, Kwelimika. I heard people say that they find the content of that Kwelimika channel greatly informative. Their opinion, not mine. So you might want to consider subscribing too. Just something I heard people say. Back to the video. Now, where was I? Oh yes. The originators of dynastic Kemet came from Nubia. Yes, now is Nubia really older than ancient Egypt? Yes, it is. According to the work of Dr. Bruce Williams and other archaeologists, Nubia seems to predate pharaonic Egypt by at least 800 to 1000 years. This is evidenced by findings such as the Kustul incense burner and other elaborate ceramic pots that were dated to 3800 BC, a very long time ago when you contrast that with dynastic Egypt, which is believed to have begun around 3300 to 3100. Nubian civilization, in contrast, is believed to have begun around 5000 to 4000 BC. And they believe this because one does not develop such elaborate pieces of art as this incense burner within 2 centuries. Such art takes a long time to develop. It takes a long time to reach such fine elaboration, if you get what I mean. That's why although the ceramic pots are dated to 3800 BC, they push back the date of the creation of the civilization to at least 4500 BC to 5000 BC. Therefore, while Kemet was still in its infancy during its pre-dynastic period, Ta-Seti was already a big girl with powerful rulers and a major civilization of its time. This was already mentioned in the previous video among the characteristics of the Nakta I culture, which stated that Nakta I is characterized by trade with important civilizations of its time such as Mesopotamian civilizations and Nubia. So by the scholar's own admission there, Ta-Seti was already an important civilization when Kemet was still in its infancy. yet this is hardly openly admitted or mentioned. See for instance this Wikipedia article on Nubia. It gives people the impression that Nubian civilization is only from 3500 BC, while we know that it was already a major civilization by Nacta I, which is from 3900 BC. See the crookery there? However, when you click on the link of the A group period of Nubian civilization, you quickly learn that the date is actually around 3800 BC instead of 3500 BC. The crookery does not stop there, however. Take a look at what the University of Chicago says about the Kustul burner that they excavated in Nubia. This incense burner is distinctively Nubian in form. Carved in the technique of Nubian rock art, it is decorated on the rim with typical Nubian designs. It is found in the tomb of a Nubian ruler at Kustul and incorporates images associated with Egyptian pharaohs, a procession of sacred boats, the white crown of Upper Egypt, a falcon deity, and the palace facade called a serek. It appears to represent a ritual that involved a royal procession by boat to a palace. Now let's see how they explain all that Egyptian pharaonic imagery. How did Nubia relate to Egypt during the A group? The scenes depicted on the Kustul incense burner have excited considerable interest and discussion. Why would seemingly Egyptian symbols have been used in Nubia? One interpretation is that Nubian A group rulers and early Egyptian pharaohs used related royal symbols. Similarities in rock art of A group Nubia and Upper Egypt support this position. Another view suggests that the decoration was carved by Nubians in imitation of Egyptian art and rituals. In this perspective, A-group Nubian rulers would have emulated the symbols of Egyptian pharaohs, whose prestige and power were evident. So the first interpretation there of the reason why pharaonic tradition is found in Nubia states that it's because the Nubians and the Egyptians were using the same symbols of power, since they are from the same region, which makes sense, right? Now the question is, who copied who? So to the University of Chicago, they claim that they believe the Kustul burner was copied from Egyptians. Now that right there is just some intellectual dishonesty. Whatever important thing is found in Nubia, scholars always try to attribute it to ancient Egypt some way, somehow. And that is just some BS behavior. The Kustul burner was found in Nubia, not in Egypt. That's one fact. It contains typical Nubian rock art. They claimed it themselves, right? According to the scholars themselves. Yet they still want to attribute it to Kemet. What's their reasoning? Well, there are some pharaonic symbols on it. So yeah, that must mean the Nubians copied the Egyptians. This is always their assumption. They can't assume otherwise. Even if another obvious explanation is that pharaonic tradition was already in use in Nubia before it ever was in Kemet, since at the time the incense burner was made, Egypt was barely beginning the monarchy thing, while Nubia was already a major civilization with a monarchy for at least 500 years. So why not attribute those symbols to them, since they found the incense burner there in the first place, and they even believe that it was made by Nubians? Why not? The decorations around the Kustul burner are typical Nubian decorations. They stated it. But no, to them, it's gotta be the Egyptians, just because I got this fairy tale in my mind telling me that nothing of consequence can come out of Nubia.
This is an absurdity.
Pathetic. The evidence is there to support a Nubian origin of the pharaonic symbols. Let's do a little thought experiment here. Just imagine if they had found this incense burner in Sumer or Mesopotamia. They would have decreed without the shadow of a doubt that pharaonic tradition started in Mesopotamia or in Sumer. End of the story. But since it's in Africa, in Nubia there, they start doubting the origin and prefer instead to make up a bedtime story about how Egyptians invented something that their neighbors were practicing before them. They even state that they have evidence of earlier pharaonic tradition at Abydos. But I checked it out, and their so-called evidence is nothing more than a few paintings of some Egyptian lord. They don't see the crown there. We don't see the crown. We don't see the white crown of Upper Egypt. The wall paintings, as I read the article, which I'm not gonna post here, I'm just gonna link it in the description if you wanna check it out. The wall painting does not contain the pharaonic symbols that came from Upper Egypt. I checked the oldest pharaonic symbols with the white crown at Abydos, and and they were dated to 3000 BC, not 3400 BC, while the Castule incense burner is dated at 3200 BC. In any case, the man who founded the Castule incense burner himself, that is, Professor Bruce Williams of the University of Chicago, believes that the Nubians were using pharaonic symbols before the Egyptians ever did. To him, it's quite simple. The Egyptians merely copied and incorporated what their predecessors from Nubia were already doing. This makes sense since the pre-dynastic Egyptians themselves came from Lower Nubia. Also, as I mentioned in the previous video, the Egyptians believed that their god, who was also a Nubian god, first passed by Nubia, then went on to Egypt. This could be interpreted as Egypt taking its spirituality from Nubia, and the further land of Punt, which is located further inside the continent of Africa. And this makes sense since Nubia is a clear bridge between the interior of the continent and Egypt.
That's very audacious, Mr. Garrett.
I think of it in purely logical terms.
And this is not just my opinion. Diodorus Siculus seemed to agree with the Nubians when they told him that Egypt was a colony of Ethiopia. Here is the quote. Now the Ethiopians, as historians relate, were the first of all men, and the proofs of this statement, they say, are manifest, for that they did not come into their land as immigrants from abroad, but were natives of it, and so justify bear the name of autochthons is, they maintain, conceded by practically all men. So as you can see here, Diodorus Siculus seems to tell us that Egypt is a colony of Ethiopia. They came from Ethiopia. Ethiopia here refers to Nubia. And also he states that all historians at the time, all ancient men, seemed to believe that Ethiopia was the first country of this world. And when you read the full quote, you also realize that ancient men believed that Africa was the cradle of humanity, which has been confirmed by modern science. Let's continue reading. Diodorus Siculus continues. They say also that the Egyptians are colonists sent out by Ethiopians, Osiris having been the leader of the colony, and the larger part of the customs of the Egyptians are, they hold, Ethiopian, the colonists still preserving their ancient manners. For instance, the belief that their kings are gods, the very special attention which they pay to their burials, and many other matters of a similar nature are Ethiopian practices. So here you can see that Diodorus Siculus does not seem to question all those practices because he saw them both in Ethiopia and Egypt. Now here are some other quotes of some scholars who agree with this position. Joseph Vogel wrote that the period when sub-Saharan Africa was most influential in Egypt was a time when neither Egypt, as we understand it culturally, nor the Sahara, as we understand it geographically, existed. Populations and cultures now found south of the desert roamed far to the north. The culture of Upper Egypt, which became dynastic Egyptian civilization, could fairly be called a Sudanese transplant. So, as you can see here, this scholar seems to agree that Upper Egyptians who later on civilized Egypt were Nubians. As Diodorus Siculus said, they were just Ethiopian colonists. Another scholar is British Africanist Basil Davidson, who outlined that the ancient Egyptians belonged, that is, not to any specific Egyptian region or Near Eastern heritage, but to that wide community of peoples who lived between the Red Sea and the Atlantic Ocean, shared a common Saharan Sudanese culture, and drew their reinforcements from the same great source, even though as time went by, they also absorbed a number of wanderers from the Near East.
Ancient Nubia and ancient Egypt share roots, common cultural roots in Northeast Africa, in the Sahara, and along the Nile Valley. The ancient Egyptians and the ancient Nubians can both be described, especially in the earlier periods, as being descendants of Northeast African indigenous populations. As one writer said, all of these people are Africans, and I define Africans as people whose biological histories have emerged and their identities have emerged in Africa, and where any mixing that took place on African soil.
Okay, now I'll give a brief outline of the history of Nubia, then we'll move on to the peopling. Nubia's history stretches back thousands of years before the existence of Christ. It's a very long time ago. According to the General History of Africa, Volume 2, Nubia has a long history which is dated from about 7000 BC to 700 CE. That's after Christ was born. That's a very, very long time. Holy cow. Almost 8,000 years of history. Anyways, this very long period of time is divided into several parts. These periods are the prehistoric period, from 7000 BC to 4000 BC. By this point, Nubia was already farming and producing pottery. During this period, Nubia is also known to have built the world's first astronomical site known as Nabta Playa. Yes, they did. You can Google it. It seems just like humanity, astronomy too was born in Africa. After the prehistoric period, we have the A group Nubians, who lasted from 4000 BC to 3000 BC. By this time, they were already a full-on civilization with big towns and rulers and such. These Nubians were also very influential to Upper Egyptians, who later on unified Kemet. Then we have early Kerma from 3000 BC to 2400 BC. So it seems there had been a shift there because the Egyptians, who had then become a dynastic empire, they decided to crush the very people who influenced them, who were so very influential to them. It's so tragic. How can you beat your older sister, Egypt? Naughty child of Africa. What a naughty girl. Then comes the C group Nubians, who lasted from 2400 BC to 1500 BC.
1550 BC. Little precision there.
Then comes the Kerma culture. By this time, Egypt had taken over as the main powerful civilization of the Nile Valley, but the Kerma culture came to show them that Nubia was not done yet. So during this period, powerful rulers arose and conquered more land, constructed beautiful cities and buildings. Then from 700 BC to 500 BC,
542 BC. Little precision there, Kodemika.
I know. 542 BC, thank you. Okay, in 500 BC comes the Napatan period, also known as Kush, when powerful kings such as Shomarka ruled and freed their brothers in Kemet from the horrific rule of Asiatic foreigners during the 25th dynasty of Kemet. HomeTeam History did a video on this period. You should check out his channel, I love the content there. Then comes Meroe, from 542 BC to 400 CE. Long time right there. How about a millennium? This is when the capital of the kingdom of Kush was shifted from Napata to Meroe. This period is also quite impressive with beautiful architecture and script invention such as the Meroitic script and other powerful rulers such as the queen or Kandake Amanorines. That was a queen. She defeated the Roman army and stopped further Roman expansion into Africa and showed the Romans who was the boss. Yeah. HomeTeam History did a video on that too. Really, go check out his channel. Then lastly, we have Christian era Nubia, then Islamic era Nubia. This is where one can find some of the world's first cathedrals and monasteries at Dongola built by Nubians. This last bit of information of the Dongola cathedrals and monasteries was mentioned by Robin Walker during a conversation he had with the YouTube channel HAPI Film in her series Happy Talk. You should go check out her channel too. And the very informative discussion they had with Robin Walker, the Black History Man, link in the description. I loved that discussion. I believe it should have more views than it actually has. Alright, that's pretty much the brief outline of the history of Nubia. I wish I could go further into details, but that would turn this video into a 2-hour or 3-hour long video. So what I'll do is urge you to go look these periods up and enjoy the history it provides. Also check out HomeTeam History's channel for more content on Nubia. It's pretty great what he does. Now, on to the next part of the video, the peopling. The people of Nubia were known for their longevity and skill with the bow and arrow. It was said in ancient Greece that the Nubians lived the longest in the world. This seems to suggest that they were very knowledgeable in medicine and healthy diets. Their military was a force to be reckoned with, as Nubian soldiers were often hired in various ancient civilizations to fight in their wars. The Nubians were also known for having several female rulers who could command armies. This aspect of their culture was frowned upon by other Eurasian cultures as evidenced by chauvinists like Strabo in their writings. Now that's the difference between Eurasian cultures and African cultures. In most of African cultures, the woman is not looked down upon or forbidden from participating in governance. In African culture, the woman is regarded as the source of life itself and creation. How can you not respect that? And if a woman was to be a leader, the people did not see a problem with it, unlike in other parts of the world, where people would rather die and go to war than accept a woman as their leader. But I digress. Let's keep going. As for the way the Nubians looked, we don't need to say too much here. They were black Africans, period. As I said in the intro, unlike Egypt, Nubia does not have a race controversy. However, there are still those delusional, brainwashed people who come in my comment section and say things like the Nubians weren't black, they were mixed, so you can't say they were a black civilization. Bruh. That's funny. The desperate attempts of certain people to remove grandiosity from the history of Africa are just pathetic. They say these kind of things because they see that Nubia has tons of great achievements and they go like, oh shit, how can this be African? Just like they did for Egypt, just like they did for Great Zimbabwe, just like they did for the Elephant sculptures. They just can't accept it. I'm sure I'm going to get some comments about how the Nubians were mixed with Asians and that's why they got their civilization. That view is no longer sustainable today. Mentalities have moved on, so move on too, please. Anyway, that's an anticipated response to that kind of future comments. Anyways, just look at some depictions by the Egyptians of the Nubians. See right there, that jet black skin and that dark brown skin and those features. Here are some depictions by the Greeks of the Nubians. Okay, again, dark brown skin, those features speak for themselves. And finally, here are some depictions of the Nubians by themselves because they left a lot of depictions of themselves. Actually, their iconography is the same as that of ancient Egypt. Those features, they speak for themselves, but I'm just showing you this to understand why they could not claim that these weren't black people. Although some did try once they discovered great things in the Sudan, but they failed. So as they couldn't, they gave Nubia a silence treatment. Pathetic. Even though Nubian civilization left as many monuments, burial sites, and artifacts and iconographies as ancient Egypt, they still wouldn't show it to the world. They don't want to. It doesn't fit the narrative. And you know what the narrative is. Anyways, let's move on. We're not here to talk about that. Wikipedia even has a section on craniofacial studies performed on Nubian skeletons by Shomarka Keita in their Nubia article. And guess what the studies say? It confirms the iconography. The Nubians were basically Nilotic people, therefore tropical Africans, therefore black people. But the very fact that the Wikipedia page of the Nubia article puts a study on the racial makeup of the Nubians just shows you that there were still attempts to remove it from Africa. Anyways, it's not even only the iconography that says that. People who saw the Nubians also described them as very dark complexioned. They were black. And that's why their achievements are often downplayed, overlooked, attributed to others, as we've seen previously, or simply ignored. Yeah, the ignoring part is very much present. Like, everybody just ignores Nubia, like it doesn't exist in the ancient world. Like, it's not one of the major first civilizations. I mean, it's in the top 3. You have Nubia, Sumer, and Egypt. Those were the earliest civilizations on Earth, but often you only hear Mesopotamia and Egypt. You never hear of Nubia. That's why I said their achievements are simply ignored, and that would serve as a segue into the next part of our video, some great achievements by the Nubians. So what are some great achievements of the people of Ta-Seti? The Nubians built the first ever astronomical observatory in the world. That is Nabta Playa, which I mentioned earlier. This site is dated at around 5000 BC, that is 7000 years ago, although many other scholars believe that the site is much older. The Nabta Playa site is believed by UNESCO to have stellar and solar alignments for use as a calendar. This is also where the Egyptian solar calendar originates, aka the most accurate calendar ever made, which is still in use today. Yes, that's right. The way we count days and years today was invented in Ta-Seti and Kemet thousands of years ago. How the idea got to us is that the Romans stole the idea from Egypt, misunderstood it in the process, and claimed it was theirs. Typical of these people. Anyways, The Egyptians and the Nubians already counted their years following the Earth's position relatively to that of the sun. Yeah, it's not a modern concept. You don't need machines to do that. You just need to look at the sun and study the stars. This also implies that the Egyptians and the Nubians already knew that the Earth was a sphere, not a flat pizza. In Africa, most civilizations already knew that the Earth was a sphere. Aside from being the first astronomers, the Nubians were also among the first, if not the first, to come up with the concept of the monarchy. Yes, that's right. The Nubians were probably the first people to have invented the concept of kings and rulers and the monarchy. They came up with a system of government that pretty much influenced the whole world, from Kemet and later the rest of Africa and the Western world. Now that's quite the achievement right there. I thought before I knew what the Nubians really were that they were just good at shooting arrows in the desert. I didn't know all this. Now you know too, if you didn't already know. The Nubians were also builders. They built cities and temples with beautiful African architecture that were just as great as those of Kemet. The people of Kush / Ta-Seti also built a lot of pyramids and even more impressive cities. As a matter of fact, there are currently twice as many pyramids in Nubia today as there are in Egypt. But the sad story with the Nubian pyramid is this. Some Italian criminal saw fit to destroy the resting place of people's ancestors because he wanted the gold inside of it.
I want gold, gold, gold.
Some barbaric and greedy behavior.
Gold, gold, gold. I want gold.
It's a resting place. You're seeing monuments. You are like, might be gold inside. Let me destroy it. Who does that? One does not expect such behaviors out of a truly civilized person. Anyhow, let's carry on. The Nubians were also a great military force. Their military was so great that the Egyptian pharaohs were often wary of their neighbors to the south, which eventually pushed them to build this. Yes, that's right. They built a huge castle called the Fortress of Buhen because they don't want to call it a castle, but it's a castle. When you look at it, it's a castle. So the pharaohs basically had to build the world's first ever massive castles in order to keep the Nubians at bay. That's saying something about the Nubian force. One might also ask, why are the Nubians so angry at Kemet? Well, that's because Kemet turned on Nubia, That's what you get for turning against your older sister who taught you much of what you knew. She will become a constant threat to you because you crushed her before. What the hell, man? You think you're gonna get away with that? There is even another bigger fortress built during the reign of Sesostris I that is now under the dam of Aswan. Sad. The military might of Kush was so great that the Romans, who had conquered pretty much everyone of the ancient world at the time, they had to back off in front of the military might of Kush. The Nubians also invented writing, which is known as the Meroitic script. The Nubians also traded gold and other important materials with the ancient world. Their Kushite rulers were so powerful that they once freed Kemet from the Assyrian invaders and initiated the famous 25th dynasty, the dynasty of the so-called Black Pharaohs, as if they were the only ones. Anyways, you and I know that the Black Pharaoh narrative is a foolery of modern scholars. We know that most pharaohs were black, but I digress. The Kushite rulers of the 25th dynasty probably controlled the largest empire in the world at the time. And lastly, Nubia was the place Kemet and the ancient world looked towards when it came to religion and spirituality. In the ancient world especially, Africa was regarded as the source of spirituality. This is evidenced by the cult of Isis and Ammon being present all over Eurasia. And what's the source? Africa. Punt, then Kush, then Kemet, then the rest of the world. The perfect priestess of Ammon was to be a Nubian woman. The oracles throughout the ancient world were chosen from Nubia as well. And remember the quote from the Papyrus of Ani: "The god Amon, the Almighty himself, coming from Punt, first passes by the land of Ta-Seti, that is Nubia, then goes to Kemet, that is Egypt, then goes to the rest of the world." Right, let's sum up. What have we learned about Ta-Seti? Ta-Seti was home to one of the world's earliest civilizations. She was older than Kemet. She was Kemet's older sister. Ta-Seti was home to the first pharaohs, very influential to the Upper Egyptians, who later on went on to conquer the two lands of Kemet. She was a great ancient African civilization that was no less impressive or complex than Kemet. Her people were indubitably black Africans, and they created one mighty and unique civilization. At a time where Europe was living in caves, Ta-Seti was already observing the sky and creating a calendar at Tnapta Playa. Yet when we talk about the history of astronomy, it is often disregarded. We are told about Greece and their discovery of the spherical Earth, while Ta-Seti already knew this. It is a shame that it is not given the respect and recognition it is due, but this will change now with your help. Simply by you pressing the like button and sharing this video with as many people as you can. And if you like what you've just watched and want more videos like this, be sure to press the subscribe button below and leave a comment. I'd really appreciate that. Thank you for watching this video. Peace.